The war was over, though the shame of surrender still burned in the hearts of the Japanese soldiers who now lived behind American barbed wire. To them, capture had always meant dishonor. Mothers had told their sons, "Better to die with honor than to live as the enemy's prisoner." Yet here they were, alive, uncertain, stripped of uniforms, reduced to numbers stitched on their jackets. Among them was Kenji Sato, a 21-year-old student who had been drafted in the final year of the war. He had grown up in a culture where Americans were painted as devils, cruel, barbaric, merciless. In his mind, captivity meant humiliation, starvation, perhaps even death. For weeks in the camp, he avoided eye contact with the guards, keeping his head bowed, waiting for the cruelty to begin. It never came. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the prisoners sat in the yard, an American soldier strolled casually among them. He was young, barely older than Kenji, with a cigarette dangling from his lips. In his hand was a pack, half full. Without ceremony, the soldier stopped near Kenji, pulled a cigarette from the pack, and held it out. Kenji froze. His first thought was that it was a trick. In Japan, by 1945, cigarettes had vanished from the market. Men rolled dried leaves, even scraps of newspaper, just to mimic the ritual of smoking. Real tobacco was a memory, a luxury none could afford. Now the enemy, who had dropped bombs over Tokyo and Hiroshima, was offering him one freely? The soldier said nothing, only gestured with his hand. The other prisoners stared. Some whispered in disbelief. Kenji's fingers trembled as he reached out and took the cigarette. He expected the soldier to laugh, to snatch it back, to mock him. But instead, the American pulled another from the pack, placed it between his own lips, and lit both. For a moment, the two young men sat across from each other, smoke curling into the evening air. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The silence itself was louder than war. Kenji inhaled deeply, the sharp burn of tobacco filling his lungs. It was the first real cigarette he had smoked in years. He closed his eyes, almost dizzy with memory, of nights before the war when his father smoked on the veranda, when the world had not yet collapsed. He exhaled slowly, and when he opened his eyes, the American was watching him, not with hatred, but with something else, recognition. Around them, other soldiers began doing the same, offering cigarettes to prisoners, lighting them without ceremony. Soon the yard filled with thin columns of smoke, rising together into the sky. Enemies who had faced each other across battlefields now sat side by side, sharing a ritual older than the war itself. Kenji felt confusion flood him. Was this mercy? Mockery? Or was it something far stranger, that the enemy did not see him as less than human? He stared at the burning tip of his cigarette, glowing like a fragile ember in the dusk, and thought, perhaps this is what peace feels like. That night, in his hidden notebook, he wrote, "Today the enemy gave me a cigarette. I do not understand why. In that moment, I remembered my father. I remembered being human. War taught me to expect cruelty. Instead, I tasted tobacco." The next day, the story of the cigarette spread through the barracks like a rumor of impossible good fortune. Men who had once marched with rifles now whispered about the American who gave away tobacco as if it were nothing. Some dismissed it as a trick, a momentary show meant to lull them into complacency. Others, quieter and more thoughtful, wondered if it was simply kindness. Kenji Sato woke with the taste of smoke still in his mouth. He had written about it in his notebook the night before, but even reading his own words by the dim light of morning, he found it hard to believe. He touched the stub of the cigarette he had carefully saved, tucked inside a fold of paper. He could not bring himself to throw it away. To him, it was not tobacco. It was a symbol, proof that the world was not as simple as he had been told. That afternoon in the yard, Kenji noticed something unusual. Several Americans stood near the fence, laughing casually among themselves. In their hands were cigarette packs, shiny with foil. The guards, instead of treating the scene as an act of discipline, allowed them to cross the yard and mingle with the prisoners. The same soldier from the day before approached Kenji again. He raised 2 fingers to his lips, miming a puff, and smiled. Kenji hesitated, then nodded. This time, when the cigarette was offered, he accepted without trembling. The soldier struck a match, its flame flickering in the breeze, and the two leaned towards each other as the fire touched the ends of their cigarettes. For a brief instant, they were so close, Kenji could see the stubble on the American's chin, the flecks of green in his eyes. Around them, other prisoners began doing the same, offering cigarettes to prisoners, lighting them without ceremony. Soon the yard filled with thin columns of smoke rising together into the sky. Enemies who had faced each other across battlefields now sat side by side, sharing a ritual older than the war itself. Kenji felt confusion flood him. Was this mercy? Mockery? Or was it something far stranger? That the enemy did not see him as less than human. He stared at the burning tip of his cigarette, glowing like a fragile ember in the dusk, and thought, perhaps this is what peace feels like. Later that evening, as the men returned to their barracks, the yard still smelled faintly of tobacco. Prisoners whispered words they never thought to use. Good, friend, thank you. Their accents were thick, their grammar broken, but the Americans smiled and repeated the words back to them. The language lessons of the cafeteria had somehow migrated to the smoking circle, carried by the rhythm of matches striking and cigarettes burning. Kenji sat on his bunk, staring at the glowing stub in his hand. He thought of the nights back in Tokyo when he and his classmates had shared the last of a pack, joking about futures that no longer existed. He thought of his father sitting on the veranda, smoke curling into the twilight, and he thought of the American soldier sharing fire with him as if war had never happened. In his notebook, he wrote, "Second day, more cigarettes, more smoke, more confusion. The enemy does not treat me as an animal. I do not understand. Perhaps tobacco carries with it not just smoke, but memory. Perhaps it carries peace."
Within weeks, the ritual of sharing cigarettes had become part of the camp's daily rhythm. Just as the prisoners knew the sound of morning roll call and the clang of the mess hall bell, they also began to anticipate the quiet moments in the yard when the Americans would wander over, packs of tobacco in their pockets. The Japanese prisoners began calling it the hour of smoke. They would gather in loose circles near the fence, not with the discipline of soldiers, but with the restless expectancy of men starved for comfort. Some brought scraps of paper to fold into makeshift pouches, desperate to save the precious tobacco for later. Others smoked quickly, coughing on the harshness of real American cigarettes after years of substitutes. Kenji noticed the changes most in the atmosphere. Where silence had once hung heavy over the yard, now voices rose, hesitant at first, then louder, punctuated with bursts of laughter. The Americans, patient and curious, leaned against the posts and repeated words slowly. "Friend," one soldier would say, pointing first to himself, then to the prisoner beside him. "Friend." The Japanese men, awkward but determined, echoed, "Furendo." Their accents twisted the syllables, but the meaning carried. Kenji found himself repeating phrases he never thought would pass his lips. "Thank you." "Good smoke." "I am Kenji." Each word burned hotter in his throat than the cigarette, but it also carried a strange lightness. He could not explain why saying them mattered, only that it did. One afternoon, as the circle passed cigarettes from hand to hand, an older sergeant finally relented. He had resisted for weeks, muttering about humiliation and dishonor. But when an American casually offered him a cigarette, holding it out without a smile or smirk, he paused. His hand trembled as he took it. The yard went quiet as the match flared. When he exhaled, releasing smoke into the air, the silence broke into applause and laughter. For the first time since capture, the stern sergeant's face softened into something like relief. That night, Kenji wrote in his notebook, "Today, even Sergeant Ito smoked. We all cheered. For a moment, rank and shame disappeared. Only smoke rose between us. Strange that fire once destroyed our cities, but now a small fire on a match brings men together." The hour of smoke became more than habit. It became ritual, communion, a fragile bridge built on the thin paper of cigarettes and the steady glow of embers. In the rising smoke, enemies found something unexpected: recognition of themselves in the faces across from them. And though Kenji could not yet name it, he felt that these moments were teaching him something greater than language, that even after war, humanity could be shared, passed from hand to hand, like fire from a match. By early winter of 1945, the hour of smoke had grown into something much larger than anyone expected. It was no longer just the passing of cigarettes, no longer just a brief moment of relief. It became a time when guards and prisoners, enemies only months before, sat together in small circles and spoke. At first, the words were simple, limited to what little English the prisoners had picked up, or what few Japanese phrases the soldiers had scrawled in their notebooks. But soon, through broken language, hand gestures, and the universal language of smoke drifting skyward, stories began to unfold. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the yard glowed in orange light, Kenji sat across from the young American soldier who had first shared a cigarette with him. They exchanged the ritual: match, inhale, exhale, before Kenji tapped his chest and said, haltingly, "Tokyo." The soldier pointed to himself and answered, "Chicago." He repeated it slowly, as if offering a gift, "Chicago." Kenji nodded, committing the sound to memory. He could not imagine the city, but the name itself felt strange and powerful, like a password to a world beyond war. Around them, other men began to do the same. One prisoner spoke of Osaka, another of Kyoto, their voices heavy with longing. The Americans responded with their own places: Texas, New York, Boston. The names floated into the smoke, mingling together. For a moment, geography itself seemed less like a battlefield and more like a map of lives intersecting. Then came the stories. One soldier, cigarette trembling between his fingers, gestured to the sky and mimicked a falling bomb. His voice cracked as he said, "Brother, gone." Across from him, a Japanese prisoner lowered his head and muttered, "Hiroshima." Silence spread through the circle. The men smoked without speaking, united not by victory or defeat, but by grief. Another night, laughter echoed instead of sorrow. A soldier tried to mimic the bow of a Japanese greeting, bending awkwardly at the waist until the prisoners laughed so hard they doubled over, tears streaming from their eyes. In response, Kenji mimed tipping a cowboy hat like in the movies, and the Americans roared with delight. The yard, which was once heavy with silence, became filled with jokes told in fragments, gestures, and smoke. Kenji, who had once expected nothing from captivity but humiliation, found himself looking forward to these evenings. He no longer saw only guards and prisoners. He saw young men like himself, each carrying memories, each trying to forget them for the space of a cigarette. That night he wrote in his notebook, "Today we told stories. We spoke of cities, of families, of brothers gone. Smoke carried both laughter and sorrow into the air. I never thought I would laugh with the enemy. I never thought I would mourn with him either. Perhaps a cigarette is more than tobacco. It is memory shared. The ritual of smoke had become confession, laughter, remembrance. Each ember glowed briefly, then died. But in those brief moments, life returned to men who had thought themselves reduced to shadows.
By the beginning of 1946, the ritual of smoke had changed once again. What started as the casual flick of a match had become something far more intimate, far more powerful. The Americans were no longer just sharing individual cigarettes, they had begun pressing entire packs into the hands of prisoners. For men who had rolled leaves into scraps of newspaper back in Japan, a full American cigarette pack was unthinkable luxury. When the first pack was given, silence swept the circle. The cardboard was crisp, the foil intact, the tobacco fresh. The Japanese prisoners stared as though they had been handed bars of gold. Kenji held one such pack in his trembling hands. He turned it over carefully, studying the foreign letters, the bright red seal. Around him, the other prisoners watched enviously, though without resentment. They understood the ritual. What was given to one would be shared by all. Kenji opened the pack slowly, as though opening a sacred relic, and passed the cigarettes around the circle. Each man lit his smoke with reverence. The first puffs were almost ceremonial, inhaled in silence, exhaled into the cold winter air. For a moment, no one spoke. It was enough to feel the paper between their lips, to taste the sharp burn of tobacco, to hold something so impossibly plentiful. The Americans stood nearby, watching. One of them smiled faintly and said, "Plenty more." The words seemed almost unreal. For men who had watched their nation collapse into ashes, the idea of abundance was difficult to grasp. That night in the barracks, the pack was passed again, cigarette by cigarette, until only a few remained. No one hoarded, no one stole. To hoard would be to betray the ritual, to destroy the fragile bond the smoke had built. Instead, men shared, laughed, even argued about who coughed the most like an amateur smoker. The older sergeant who had once resisted the ritual now spoke more freely. Holding a cigarette between his fingers, he admitted, "I thought this would be shame, but maybe it is honor too. Honor to live, to breathe, to share. Death would have been easier. Living is harder." His words carried weight, and the others nodded solemnly. Kenji wrote that night, "Today I held a full pack. I did not keep it. I passed it. Every man smoked. Every man remembered something. Home, family, laughter, sorrow. I thought of my father again, the way he tapped his cigarette on the porch rail before lighting it. The enemy gave me that memory back. Strange. A cigarette should mean nothing, and yet it feels like everything." The packs continued to appear, week after week, until they became as expected as the morning roll call. And with every match struck, every ember glowing, the invisible wall between captor and captive thinned. The Japanese prisoners still wore numbers on their jackets, still slept behind wire, still dreamed of their ruined homeland. But in those small circles of smoke, they were something else. Simply men, breathing together, sharing fire. By spring of 1946, cigarettes were no longer only smoke and fire. They had become currency, memory, and ritual. In the dim barracks at night, men carefully saved the paper wrappings, flattening the foil as if it were silver. Some tucked away empty packs, scribbling notes in Japanese across the cardboard, turning them into secret journals. What had once been a symbol of indulgence became a vessel for memory. Kenji Sato was among them. In his small notebook, already crowded with fragments of English words and sketches of faces, he taped the torn corner of a Lucky Strike pack. Next to it, he wrote in uneven English letters, "I remember peace." The cigarettes had begun to draw more than smoke from the men. They drew out stories. Every evening, as the circle lit up, voices began to flow more freely than before. A cigarette in hand seemed to loosen the tongue, to make grief easier to speak. One night, Sergeant Ito, the man who once resisted the ritual, took a long drag and exhaled slowly.
Then, staring into the ember, he said in a low voice, "Okinawa, my brother. He died there. I saw his body." The yard grew quiet. Even the Americans lowered their heads. A soldier broke the silence, fumbling with words in broken Japanese. My brother, too." He pointed to himself, then to the sky, miming a plane shot down. The prisoners understood. It was a moment no one had expected. The grief of two nations, spoken not in politics or speeches, but in smoke, fire, and silence. Another evening, laughter replaced sorrow. One soldier tried to teach the prisoners the phrase, "No problem." The Japanese men repeated it clumsily, "No problema," until both sides doubled over in hysterics. Kenji laughed until his ribs hurt. He wrote later, "We laughed tonight. We forgot we were enemies. Smoke joined us. Words joined us. Even mistakes became joy." As the days grew warmer, some Americans began leaving packs deliberately on the benches, walking away without a word. The prisoners would find them like gifts from unseen hands, proof that trust, fragile but real, had been planted in the soil of captivity. Soon the men decided to create something permanent. Using the empty packs, scraps of cardboard, and pages torn from notebooks, they built a kind of scrapbook. Each man contributed, a drawing of home, a few words in Japanese, an awkward English phrase. An American soldier even added his own photograph, scribbling, "To my friend Kenji," on the back. By the end of the month, the scrapbook was thick with layers of memory, bound together not by glue or string, but by the simple ritual of sharing cigarettes. Kenji stared at it one night before lights out, his hands trembling. He whispered to himself, "This should not exist, yet it does. A book of friendship made from smoke." For him, it was more than paper. It was proof. Proof that war did not erase humanity, and that even in the ashes of defeat, men could build something lasting.
By midsummer of 1946, whispers began to ripple through the camp. Transfer orders, repatriation. The war was long over, and the Allies were preparing to send prisoners back to their homelands. For the Japanese men, the words carried both relief and dread. Home meant family, but it also meant ruins, hunger, and the shame of return. The announcement changed the atmosphere of the hour of smoke. What had once been a daily comfort became more precious, almost sacred. Each cigarette shared might be the last, each ember a final reminder of an impossible bond. On one of the final evenings, the men gathered as always. The Americans came too, not with rifles slung across their shoulders, but with easy strides, hands already reaching into pockets. Packs were passed, matches struck, the familiar glow of fire lighting faces in the dusk. But tonight was different. The air was heavy, the laughter thinner, the silences longer. Men smoked more slowly, dragging out each inhale as though to hold time itself still. Kenji sat with his usual partner, the young American from Chicago. The soldier handed him a pack, this time unopened, full. Kenji stared, unable to move. It was too much, too generous. He shook his head, pushing it back, but the soldier insisted, pressing it into his hand with a firm nod. For a long moment, Kenji simply held it. The weight of the pack seemed enormous, as though it carried not just tobacco but every memory of the camp. Fear, laughter, grief, humanity. Finally, with trembling fingers, he opened it, passed the cigarettes one by one around the circle. The men smoked in silence. Some closed their eyes, imagining home. Others stared at the sky, watching the smoke rise and vanish into the evening. Then, unexpectedly, Sergeant Ito spoke. His voice was rough but steady. "When I return, I will tell my son, the enemy shared fire with me. Not bullets, fire." He exhaled smoke slowly, and for once no one corrected him. No one laughed. The weight of his words settled like ash across the circle. The American soldier looked at Kenji then, and in broken Japanese said, "Tomodachi," friend. Kenji's throat tightened. He wanted to answer in English, to mirror the word, but his voice caught. Instead, he reached out, pressed his palm to his chest, then extended it toward the soldier. The meaning was clear. That night, back in his bunk, Kenji wrote in his notebook for the last time. "We smoked together for the final time. I carry an unopened pack. I will not smoke it. I will keep it. Proof that peace can be found in smoke, that friendship can exist even when war says it cannot. Tomorrow I leave, but tonight I remember." The following morning, the prisoners lined up with their belongings. Trucks waited. The Americans stood watching, some with hats in their hands, some raising cigarettes in silent salute. The Japanese men bowed deeply, one final gesture of respect. Smoke lingered faintly in the yard, the last trace of a ritual that had turned strangers into something more. Years later, in the small fishing town where Kenji Sato rebuilt his life, the unopened pack of American cigarettes still sat wrapped in cloth inside a wooden box. The war had ended, the occupation had passed, and Japan itself was changing. Yet Kenji never touched it. He married, raised children, worked as a school teacher. His students never guessed that their quiet instructor had once worn a uniform, had once believed it better to die than be captured. Only in rare moments, when the evening air grew heavy with the scent of tobacco drifting from street vendors, would memories of the camp return. One autumn, long after gray streaks had crept into his hair, his eldest son found the box. Inside lay the notebook, its pages yellowed, filled with sketches, fragments of English, and confessions written in a young man's trembling hand. And next to it, the pack of Lucky Strikes, unopened, its seal still intact. "Father," the boy asked softly, "why do you keep this? Why never smoke it?" Kenji lifted the pack carefully, running his fingers over the faded paper as though it were gold leaf. His eyes grew distant, traveling back across the ocean, back through barbed wire and smoke. "Because," he said at last, "it is not tobacco, it is memory. When I was a prisoner, the enemy shared this with me, not to mock, not to humiliate, but simply to remind me I was still human. I keep it so that I never forget. Even in war, there can be mercy. Even in defeat, there can be friendship." The boy was silent, but he understood in the way only a son can. That night, Kenji returned the pack to his box and closed the lid. He never opened it again. In time, the wooden box passed to his children, then to their children. Some wondered why an old cigarette pack was worth keeping. Others, opening the notebook beside it, read the words of a young man who once sat in the yard of an American camp, smoke curling into the sky, learning for the first time that the world was larger, kinder, and more complicated than war had told him. And so the cigarette pack remained, not smoked, not discarded, but preserved. A fragile ember from a forgotten time, a reminder that sometimes peace is found not in treaties or speeches, but in the simple act of two enemies sharing fire.